Okay, so this is 100% true. I'm 23 now, and this happened about 10 years ago, so I guess I was probably around 13 or 14 years old. Anyway, I used to skateboard all the time with my friends, Tim and Brandon. Well, one day we got done skating and decided to go to 7-Eleven to get some food and drinks before we went home. Remember, I was only 13 or 14, so it's not like there was any driving involved. Instead, we skated to the 7-Eleven, and we're planning on skating back home as well. Anyway, we buy our drinks and leave the store. We walk to the parking lot's exit and prepare to cross the highway. It was not very busy since it's a small town that we live in. While we waited for the traffic light to turn red so we could cross, I looked behind me to the 7-Eleven gas pumps. I noticed a 40 or 50-year-old man pouring gas into his white truck. He stared directly at me. Before I even knew it, he dropped the gas pump and jumped into his truck. He slammed on the gas and sped straight at my friends and I. He just barely missed us, but he grazed my arm and knocked my skateboard out of my hand. My friend Brandon screamed, "What are you doing, you fucking dick?" as the man peeled out and sped into the parking lot, right next to 7-Eleven. I swear to God, he even drove through a ditch and tried to run us over again. This is where things got really bad. The three of us started running away at full speed, across the highway and toward the local library, which was 2 or 3 blocks away. We were about 1 block away when I looked back and saw that maniac speeding towards us, full of rage. Brandon and Tim managed to run up to the library doors, while I wouldn't make it, so I ran towards the woods. It was Sunday, so I knew the library was closed, and there was a trail in the woods which led to my backyard. Meanwhile, this maniac peeled into the parking lot and jumped out of his truck. I looked behind me briefly before escaping into the woods, and saw him either grab a shotgun or a crowbar. I was pretty far away at this point, and I was freaking out as well, so my vision wasn't exactly great, from the bed of his truck. I ran all the way home. When I finally got to my street, my neighbor, Tim's dad, told me to get in his car because we had to go to the video store, which is where Tim's mom worked. When I got there, I found Tim and Brandon. They had run to the store after realizing the library was closed. There were also 3 cops as well. A minute later, my mom came in crying her eyes out because Brandon and Tim told her they didn't even know if I was alive or not. Every single person there thought I had been captured. Tim told me he'd seen the guy running after me into the woods, which is scary because I thought the maniac was chasing them, not me specifically. Anyway, he was never caught, and I spent the next 5 years worrying about every white truck I ever saw. I forgot the most scary part too. My town is small, but it's not empty. There were plenty of people around while this was going on. I felt so helpless, running for my life while there were at least 100 people around not doing a thing about it. To be clear, we didn't do anything to provoke this man at all. He just tried to hit us for no reason, and that's fucking scary. Sure, Brandon called him a dick, but that was after he already tried to kill us. We were good kids just trying to walk home, and we almost died because of it. I lived in this bizarre little house as a child. It was incredibly tall and thin, kind of like an attached house except freestanding, with 3 floors, a basement, and an attic. It was full of quirks such as 2 fully functional fireplaces, a shower stall in the center of the basement, and a backyard so small you couldn't even take 5 paces without hitting the fence. There was also an old-timey rope-pulled dumbwaiter that led from the kitchen to my bedroom. I loved that weird little place, but unfortunately it was incredibly old. And half of its charm was the fact that it seemed to have been designed by an inarticulate conclave of lunatics. Eventually, the repair costs far exceeded what my parents were willing to sink into it, and we had to move away. Preparing for the move was a bit of a chore. I packed most of my stuff myself. I had taken to throwing stuff down the dumbwaiter and shoving all my clothes so thickly into my closet that they basically became a single solid mass of fabric. While clearing that closet out, in fact, I came across a feature I had never noticed before. I noticed an attic entrance in the roof. Being an adventurous kid, I opened it right up. I stood on that closed brick and began my first and last exploration into the topmost part of our weird little home. The first thing I immediately noticed was that it wasn't as dark as it should have been. The place was strung with old red Christmas lights, which still burned with leftover incandescence somehow. A dozen little cracks and holes peeped down into the bedrooms below. The second thing I noticed was that the place was set up fully for habitation. The insulation was plasticed away, there was an old gurney piled with sleeping bags and sheets, and a rusted mint green refrigerator, which still worked. I even tested it myself. The third thing was the bones. There were a lot of bones up there. I was a kid at the time with a very limited understanding of anatomy, but there were all types of bones just heaped into a series of piles surrounding the center of the attic. Small and large, clean and white, from every and any imaginable sort of creature, haphazardly stacked into a half-dozen osseous clumps. 2 of them were deeply blackened, as if someone had tried to burn them away. The walls nearest to those blackened piles were scrawled in dark bone char messages. Mostly they were just smears, but the word sorry was repeated over and over again. That room had been sitting just above my head for 8 years, while I slept there unknowingly. My story goes something like this. When I was 15 and a sophomore in high school, 2 of my friends came over to stay the night. We wanted to go visit another friend's house who lived just across an arroyo. In New Mexico, that's what we call the ditches. They were only a few streets away, so it wasn't really that far of a walk. It was already about 11 p.m. though. We begged my mom to let us walk, because we 3 girls together felt like we could take on the entire world. We dressed up in hats and baggy sweatshirts, because we felt like that would make us less noticeable, I guess. What can we say? We were all teenagers. We decided to start walking after wearing down my mom, who finally agreed to allow us to go. She did try convincing us to let her drive us multiple times, and I wish we had let her do so. Walking under a very dark night sky in the cold seemed fun and adventurous to us. We laughed and talked a lot, crossed the arroyo, and turned along a street that was a little more lit than the main ones. We thought this would make it a lot safer. I mean, it was just a typical suburban neighborhood. We get 3 houses down, and in our rear we hear a car. A car is creeping up along the street without its lights on. Okay, that's a little bit creepy. We decide to hustle along because of this, only to have him speed up. Now he was right next to us. We would start walking faster, and he would match our pace. We would slow down and he'd do the same. We looked inside and saw it was a man with glasses driving alone. I was starting to get really scared. My heart was pounding, and I was regretting being a 15-year-old who felt it was a good idea to walk so after dark. The man tapped on his horn a little bit, not a loud honk but a short one. He stared right at us. Well, that's when we freaked out. We decided right then and there we were going to knock on a neighbor's door to see if they'd let us in to call my mom. All the houses along the row were completely dark, so we rushed back toward the corner house just to try before the dark arroyo we would inevitably have to come across to get home. It was the last house we could try. By the way, none of us had cell phones. This was 2001, and most high schoolers didn't have them back then. Home phones and pay phones all the way. We knocked on this door while the car followed again and stopped right in front of the house we were at. An older lady opened up the door very hesitantly with her husband. We explained that we were very sorry, but we were being followed by a man in a car and he was really scaring us. She let us in to use her phone, thankfully. I remember her house being filled wall to wall with crucifixes. Nothing against them, but in the situation, I guess that just scared me even more. When we came back outside, the car was already gone. We got picked up by my mom and got home safe. We could hardly get to sleep after that adrenaline rush, though. It was one of the scarier moments of my life. What was even scarier was that I rode my bike in broad daylight back to that house the next day to leave a thank you note for letting us in to use the phone. I mean, most people wouldn't have. As I pulled around the corner, though, I saw that same car that had been following us, parked in the neighbor's driveway. That has forever spooked me out. Now I have 2 kids of my own, and I'll never ever want them walking around at night like I did. This happened a couple of weeks ago. I just recently graduated from high school. I never really had an easy time making friends, but during quarantine I got pretty close to a couple of old acquaintances named Kevin and John. Kevin is a tall, fat kid with a ridiculously big head, short, unkempt dark brown hair, and a chin strap. John is even taller than Kevin, and around 6'4", but very skinny, with light brown hair and a zit-covered face. I actually weigh more than him despite being almost a foot shorter. They were the kind of kids that always would get into trouble, whether they're drinking, smoking, or busting into places they're not supposed to be. Anyway, even though I do some sketchy shit sometimes, drinking and smoking wasn't really my thing. Despite that, they forced me to hang out with them, and I somewhat enjoyed their company in return. We got along very well because of how we saw everyone as fake, which is weird because that's exactly what they were. This one particular time, I even let them drive my car. They took me to a place in the woods where they'd forced me to smoke. Looking back, I know they were really just using me for my car. I'm not sure why I decided to give them second chances after all the weird things they did, but I still did so anyway. About a month ago, despite many people warning me not to hang out with them anymore, I let them take me to a party against my better judgment. I was suspicious though, so I took my own car and followed them there. In retrospect, the first red flag was when they parked 2 streets away from the party, but I didn't think anything at first. As they were walking to the house, they got excited to see me crash a party, but I thought that part was a joke. We got to the address and got turned away right away. Kevin tried to convince them to let us in, but it still didn't work. I texted the host and asked him to explain what was happening. He told me we could talk tomorrow. At that point, I knew they were just using me for their own enjoyment again, but I was a lot nicer to Kevin and John than I probably should have been. In the heat of the moment, I told them I was gonna drive by, honk a bunch, and yell "fuck you" to them. I had second thoughts as soon as I said it, but now I knew John and Kevin were expecting me to do it, so I drove by the wrong street accidentally with them right on my bumper the entire time. I then drove to my house, which they luckily didn't follow me back to. Feeling upset about being used again, I just went to bed. The next day, I came to a realization and decided that enough was enough. I was tired of fake people and them using me for everything, and I knew I needed to cut them off. I texted John's girlfriend Kyra and told her to tell Kevin and John to never talk to me again, which she actually did. I explained the whole situation the best I could. I just hoped it wouldn't affect their relationship too much. Well, that very night, I got a text on Snapchat from John. "Kyra dumped me because of you, you fucking asshole." In all caps with 3 middle finger emojis. Right then, I also got a text from Kevin, which was pretty similar as well. He called me the C word and warned me to stay away from him and John from now on. I laughed to myself, thinking they really wouldn't dare do anything. They had admitted to me before they weren't as tough as they like to act, and here they were threatening me. I guess I should have taken this text more seriously. That Friday, my mother spent the day at the hospital getting some new medication for her MS. She had to spend the entire day there, since it had to be administered through an IV. My dad called me at around 5 and said she was having some side effects. She'd be okay, but she would need to spend the entire night, meaning I'd be home alone because my dad wanted to stay with her. I stayed up for a while playing Madden with all the lights off, when suddenly my neighbor called me. Confused, I picked up the phone. He sounded quite panicked. He told me I needed to hide right now and wait for the police. His wife had already called them, and they were only a couple of minutes away. I was extremely startled and confused. What the hell are you talking about? He dropped a bomb. He told me he'd just seen two people hop the fence into my backyard and start sneaking towards my house. I think my heart skipped a beat when he said that. I wondered why he didn't start off with that, but I guess it didn't matter. I had to hide right now. I went into my closet and shut the door tight. From there, I instantly heard the sound of glass breaking and slow footsteps into the common area of my house. Thankfully, the police arrived shortly thereafter because they often already had a car sitting near my house looking for speeders anyway on the main road. It felt, though, like an hour could have gone by while I was waiting. I heard multiple police officers shouting at the intruders, and shortly after, I heard a knock on the bedroom door, followed by an officer announcing himself. I yelled for him to come in, and he opened the closet door and took me back into the house. From there, I saw one of the windows in the kitchen was completely shattered, and unsurprisingly, I watched as two other officers escorted Kevin and John out of my house, both in handcuffs. My parents got back home soon after, and my dad hugged me for at least a minute. In the moment, my mom really didn't understand what was happening because of how loopy the medicine made her, but the next day she broke down in tears over how close I was to dying. A lot of things about that incident have been bothering me. The way I completely underestimated them, the evil looks they gave me as they were escorted out, and the fear I had when this was all happening. I'll get over all of that eventually, but one thing will always stick with me, and that's what I heard the police say when they first entered down the hallway. 3 words that completely changed my perspective on life. Drop the gun. Police told me Kevin and John were crouched in the foyer, and Kevin had a pistol in his hand. They believed they were waiting for me to come out of my room so they could shoot me when I didn't expect it. I still haven't totally wrapped my head around the fact things could have gone so much worse if my neighbor hadn't seen them climbing my fence. I guess it serves as a reminder of how you never know when it's your time, and to always take threats like that seriously. I've worked a few odd jobs in my life. My first job was a summer job at 16 during summer break at a dairy farm. I absolutely hated it there, and it made it harder for me to find motivation to even try working again when the time eventually came. I don't really remember how I was first referred to this job, but the following summer I ended up working as an office assistant for a self-employed photographer. My parents knew her because she used to be a member of their church, and my sister attended her 4-H program when she had it. By this time, her health had begun to take a severe hit. She claimed it was a mixture of things, like chronic Lyme to fibromyalgia. I had also been warned by my parents before taking the job that she was a little bit off. She was very religious, and claimed to have had real encounters with demons, even participated in a few exorcisms. I'm an atheist and a skeptic, so I never took those stories very seriously. Aside from the weird things she would tell me, she was mostly harmless, and working for her was not hard either. The job basically just required me to do a whole lot of data entry, as well as helping prep her photos with some minor touching up and the addition of her company watermark. Then I'd upload them to a site where her customers could browse them and pick out which ones they wanted to order. She primarily photographed horsing events, and for the first several months my job stayed in her living room, which was basically my office space at the time. Eventually, though, she talked me into tagging along at shows where she trained me as a photographer as well, and very soon I was shooting events right alongside her. It was pretty boring work, I won't lie. I'm not exactly a horse person. Things didn't get weird until a year later, when I learned the hard way that it was not her I needed to worry about. Turns out she had 2 sons. One was out of state. The other was in the Navy. The latter of the 2, a guy called Nate, I had only heard very few things about. I knew he was somewhere on the autism spectrum, but she was never exactly clear on what his diagnosis was. She very firmly believed he was vaccine injured, and all his oddities could be traced back to vaccines or something. When he finally returned home, I met him for the first time while working in her living room. All in all, he seemed like a very nice guy, actually. A little bit odd with the social cues and stuff, but not concerning. He was obsessed with movies, and being a bit of a movie buff myself, whenever he would venture into the living room to strike up a conversation, it would almost always be about whatever movies we were into or excited to see. I should also point out here I was only 18 by this point, and he was well into his mid-30s. At some point, he must have got it into his head that I was interested in him, though he never said anything directly to me. I had to find out about it from my own parents. My mom worked as the secretary at her church, and Nate knew it. I can only guess my boss had told him. One afternoon, Nate showed up at my mom's desk and just started gushing about me. He talked about how much fun I was, how he loved talking to me, how he was planning to take me to the movies and take me to his church, all these other plans he had for me. My mom was of course beyond uncomfortable, as was the pastor who happened to overhear it. When I got home that night, she told me what had happened and suggested I make sure not to lead him on. I was completely baffled because I really hadn't done anything. We'd never even discussed the possibility of doing anything together. I got even more uncomfortable around him when I overheard a conversation between himself and my boss in the next room. He was talking about his experiences in the Navy, while she was talking about the dangers of Islam. At one point, he said in this completely serious tone, "You know, if I had it my way, I'd just shoot and kill any Muslim I met. Problem solved." My boss simply laughed the comment off like it was nothing, but something about his serious tone creeped me out. I made an effort to acknowledge him less and less when he was around, and keep the conversation short while stressing I had work to do. Eventually, he got his own place and moved out of his parents' house, so I figured that was problem solved. A couple of years later, I also moved out. My boss's company had since closed, and I was now working somewhere new. I was friends with both my previous boss and Nate on Facebook, and around that time I was finally coming out as an atheist, something I could not do when I was still living at home. One random night, my old boss suddenly messaged me, asking about a ring I had on my finger in a picture. It was a black ring with a white gold star in the middle of a black circle. Already knowing where she was going with this, I told her it was just a ring for decoration. Then she started accusing me of wearing a pentagram because she didn't know what a pentacle was, and that I was promoting Satan somehow. I tried several times to explain to her that not only was it not that symbol, but also paganism has nothing to do with Satan anyways, but she refused to listen to anything I said, so I ignored her. This was fairly typical behavior for her and really not worth the argument. The very next morning, I received a message from Nate telling me I needed to come to church with him. I told him no. The messages I received back gradually grew angrier and angrier. He went from asking to demanding I go with him. He told me I was lost, and I would not find the answers I needed by living the life I was. Eventually, he outright said he thought the fact I was wearing a pentagram was disgusting, and I was opening myself up for possession. Knowing there would be even less of a point in arguing with him than there was with his mother, I went ahead and blocked them both, deciding I did not need either of them in my life anymore. Then, though, he started showing up at my workplace. He would always search through the entire store until he finally found me, and then once he did, he would corner me and not stop talking to me, no matter how many times I tried to dodge him or tell him that I was trying to work. Eventually, my managers caught on and started intercepting him whenever he would show up. I wasn't making enough to pay the rent with that job, so I had to take up a second one as well. Within a week, though, of working this second job, which was in a different town, he started showing up there too. This time, I told the managers outright what was going on, and after that, every time he showed up, I was allowed to hide in the back room behind a locked door while they sped his order along and got him out. During one of these many encounters while I was hiding in the back, one of the managers was back there with me, inputting employee time punches into the computer when both of us heard Nate shouting in our direction, "I know you remember me!" That was the last straw for them. They told him his business was no longer welcome there. He stopped showing up at my other job as well for a while, which was a relief. Fast forward a few years later, I was getting used to not having to look over my shoulder every shift or check the parking lot for his truck. Then one day he just suddenly reappeared. He happened to be browsing a section I was walking past when he spotted me and got this deer-in-the-headlights look. I made a beeline to the break room because now just even seeing him made me scared. After that, he started showing up very regularly. I would always find ways to dodge and avoid him, but he would still somehow always spot me and know exactly where I was. I was debating whether or not to tell the managers again, because at this point it had been a while since he had really done anything, and saying something just because I felt nervous didn't feel right exactly. Call me a coward or an idiot or whatever, but that was how my thought process was working. What happened next, though, made me really regret not speaking up. It was bound to happen eventually, I guess, but one night he managed to catch me while I was at the customer service desk. He approached me, said hi, and I immediately started to look for someone to signal over so I could make a break for it. Before I could even say a word, he said something that made me sick to my stomach. "Hey, how's your little girl doing? She's 3 now, right?" I looked at him horrified. I had him completely blocked on everything. I had his number blocked. I was living at a new address. I had not seen or spoken to his mother since she confronted me about that ring. I hadn't told either of them I was a parent now or that I was married, and I was not friends with anyone who knew them either, but somehow he knew everything. "How's your husband doing too?" he asked when I didn't answer. "He's good. He's a good man," I said, trying to reinforce the idea I was not available to him and I had no desire to have anything to do with him. "Oh really? Where does he work?" At this point I felt like I was going to pass out. Thankfully, another employee approached just to gather some reshelves, and I got the hell out of there. As I was leaving, he called out behind me. "I'll see you again, you know. We'll talk. We'll go out and do something together. We will." I reported him to the managers, telling them everything about the encounter, including all that information he had on me and my family that he absolutely should not have. They were able to pull up his face on CCTV, and while I've not heard anything, I'm guessing one of them finally managed to approach him, because I haven't seen him since that incident. This has been going on for 10 years, and I want it to finally be over. In 2010, I was driving from New Orleans, Louisiana to Eugene, Oregon. It was just me, 24 and female, and my 2-year-old pit bull, in a 14-foot U-Haul truck with everything I owned crammed into the back. I had my fancy flip phone and my printout of MapQuest directions. I think the first smartphones actually came out around this time, but I actually didn't have one yet. Cell phone service was also much spottier at the time, and there were long stretches through the desert where I had zero service for hundreds of miles. I was driving a lonely stretch of highway through central Texas when I realized I hadn't seen a town or exit for a very long time, and my giant U-Haul truck was really low on gas. Just when I'm starting to freak out though and seriously run low, I see a small town coming up ahead. I pull into this town and it is absolutely tiny. I was so worried about other things that I never did pay attention to the name of the town, but there must have been only 6 streets in the entire place. I go gas up and I get ready to head back onto the road. Except I cannot for the life of me find my way back to the highway now. I circle the town about 4 times and start getting frustrated. This is such a tiny town. How the hell can I not find my way out? I can literally see where the highway is, but somehow I just can't find the way to get to it. I return to the gas station to ask for directions. Now, when I first got gas, I paid at the pump and never actually went in. When I enter for directions, there's this skinny, nondescript guy who has black hair hanging down in front of his eyes. He really looked like he could use a good wash. He was not particularly creepy per se, but he was a little bit rude. He never really met my eyes. Instead, he was looking down at a magazine the entire time. He also gave me directions that really didn't sound right at all. He's telling me to take a road that will get me to the highway in about 17 miles. For a moment, I was dumbfounded. I pointed out quickly that I hadn't driven that far in the first place to get from the highway into town, so why would it be so far back to the highway? I could literally see where it was. I could literally see the location of the highway. He was so casual, almost like I was being an annoyance. He said I could follow his directions or not. Why should I care? He gave me some explanation about the road curving around that really didn't make much sense at all. He also still refused to look at me. Just, whatever, I gave you your directions, and waved his hand in the direction of the door. When I got into the parking lot, my whole body started trembling violently, and my heart started racing suddenly, seemingly for no reason. I got into the truck, and as soon as I put the key into the ignition, I burst into tears. I had this terrible feeling that no matter how nonchalant he acted, this man had bad intentions with those directions. I didn't know what exactly they were, but I knew right then and there that there was no way I was going to follow those bogus directions. And yet, this was the only store in this little town. And short of knocking on every door, no thank you. There was no one else to ask for directions. I decided I really didn't give a shit if this town seemed like something that dropped straight out of the Twilight Zone. I was going to drive around until I found my way out, even if it took all damn night. At this moment, a big beater of a pickup truck, as much rust as metal, pulled in and disgorged the quintessential Texan man. Huge, husky, and in flannel work boots. Without even thinking about it, I jumped out of the truck and approached him quickly, yet warily. Looking into his eyes, though, I could see he was a kind human being, or at least I was hoping so. I asked him if he could please give me directions to the highway. I told him I knew it was silly, but I just couldn't seem to find my way back somehow. Thankfully, he looked very concerned as I was visibly upset, so he made me laugh and very cheerfully gave me directions for a hairpin curved turnoff right at the end of the small concrete tunnel I had passed by several times. He said it was common. It often confused travelers because it was so hard to see from the outside. He said they'd need to put up some signs sometime soon. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I asked him how far in miles it was back to the highway. He laughed and gave me this funny look. "Miles, miss? I'd say it's a quarter mile at most. I mean, you can see the highway right from here." At this point, I couldn't help it. I had to know. "Well, what happens if I drive here?" I gave him the directions the man in the store had just given me. Texas looked at me very intently and asked me how I even knew about that route. It was pretty far out, and usually only locals knew about it, so I told him. He was very quiet for a few minutes, then asked what the attendant had looked like and if I had a map of the state. No, just my MapQuest map, which wasn't very helpful in this situation. He goes to his truck and grabs a raggedy local map from his glove box. Spreading it out for me, he traces the route I described to him. The way the man from the gas station had told me to go led directly away from town, away from the interstate, and led seemingly right into the middle of nowhere. Texas told me that the road did go about 17 miles, right before it dead-ended in the middle of the desert. I asked him what was out there. He told me it was nothing but some junked cars and a few trailers and mobile homes, all owned by the same family. This family was known locally as troublemakers, meth heads, and alcoholics, and these were the nice things the townspeople had to say about them. The erstwhile clerk was a part of this family and lived down that road. I'll never forget the look in Texas's eyes as he told me this. He also told me I was very smart to listen to my instincts, and told me to be careful traveling out there from now on. I don't know if the man from the gas station wanted what was in the back of my U-Haul, or what was in the driver's seat, but thankfully I didn't have to find out. Oh, and I also learned that sometimes angels look like ruddy-haired Texans with scruffy faces and rusty pickups. Thank you, random Texan stranger. You really saved my ass, and I'll always remember you with tons of love. I'm sorry I didn't ask for your name at the time. You're forever Texas to me now. This was about 4 or 5-ish years ago. Back then, I lived with my mother in a shed on a farm surrounded by woodland. Our farmland was part of a larger piece of farmland that was split up and sold off, so we did have neighbors, though they were roughly half a kilometer away each. We loved that though because of the privacy. So it wasn't like there was nobody nearby I could go to if I needed help. That thought is what had me fearlessly walking alone at night between the hours of 7 and 8 p.m. sometimes, fluctuating from earlier to later depending on the day. Sometimes I even went out on a walk at 2 a.m. in the morning because I was restless and couldn't sleep. Looking back, this was probably incredibly stupid, and after this incident I never walked after 6 p.m. ever again, always making sure there was at least some sunlight left whenever I set out. The route I always took was a road circuit. The first part was out in the open in front of all the other farms, including my own. If anything had happened, at least one person would have noticed, and reception was pretty good as well, so I would have been able to call someone. The second half, on the other hand, was concealed by about 200 meters of woods between the farms and the back road, stretching the full 2 kilometers at the back of the farm. It was during that part of the walk when I had this creepy encounter. It was late at night. I can't remember exactly what time, but I do know it was pitch black with the exception of my torchlight. I was about to approach the turn in the loop that would bring me out into the open again when I heard it. Help. It was this monotone voice that repeatedly asked for help. It didn't seem panicked in the least. I took my headphones out and turned my music off to make sure I was hearing correctly, but it didn't stop. Help. Help. A very stupid part of me almost responded, because for some reason my first instinct was, oh no, someone's in trouble, like a naive kid, although I would have been about 16 or 17 at the time. Of course, my rational brain kicked in, and realized that approaching a random voice was just about the stupidest thing I could do. I started quietly backing away. Unfortunately, my cat had also followed me on this walk and was not backing away with me. No, she was walking toward the voice, softly hissing. I remember desperately trying to get her to come back towards me without alerting the voice to my presence, just in case they hadn't noticed me yet. I was getting scared and didn't want to stay there a moment more, so I ran forwards and grabbed her, then turned around and bolted back towards my house. I don't know if it was stupid of me to turn my back to the voice as I was making so much noise while running. There would have been no way they wouldn't have known I was there, and I would have had no way of knowing if they were giving chase. I was so terrified the entire time. The image of someone cloaked in shadows chasing me entered my mind, even though I couldn't hear anyone behind me. I never once slowed down until I was back safe and sound within my own home. The story doesn't end there, though. Despite how terrifying that experience was, there was still a part of me that was concerned about whoever it was that was asking for help, because what if they really needed it? So I asked my mother to drive us to the location. Another very stupid decision considering what we found, that being a whole lot of nothing. We called out and called out to the person, but nobody ever answered. We didn't get out of the car though. Luckily, neither of us were that stupid. We drove home having seen nothing, and no one. It still bothered me in the morning though, so I had my mother drive us over again, and we searched the immediate area. Nothing. No indication anyone had ever been there. There was no body either, which was admittedly a drastic thing to search for. But I know shock can leave you eerily calm, which could have explained the monotone voice, and the lack of response afterwards made me fear we'd been too late, and we'd find a dead person in the morning. I don't know if I would have preferred that outcome, but then at least I would have had a face to put to the voice. But no, we found absolutely nothing, and to this day I have no idea who that voice belonged to and why they were so monotonously calling out for help. My mind has naturally come to some chilling conclusions and theories that leave me unable to sleep. Perhaps a rapist, a kidnapper, a serial killer, all the classic horror stories. But I guess I'll never really know for sure. A few years ago, I was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside the suburbs. It seemed like the perfect balance of having space and having nice neighbors, close enough to not feel isolated. The area had no streetlights though, so it was very dark at night, especially if there were clouds blocking out the moonlight. This didn't really bother me though. Actually, it made my house feel even more quaint on dark nights. I got home from work one day in midwinter. It was a very cloudy night, so pulling up to my house, I saw only what my headlights and front porch light illuminated. When I got out of my car though, I immediately caught a whiff of cigarette smoke. That was very odd, as I had never smelled that before around the house. I didn't see anyone nearby though, so I ignored that smell and went inside. I had just gotten off a shift with a few hours of overtime, so I was extremely tired. Even though it wasn't even 7 o'clock yet, I decided to take a shower and call it a night right away. I was abruptly woken sometime later, sure that I had just heard a noise inside my house. I wasn't worried right away because my friend would sometimes stop by to use my shower after work. On his way to his night classes, I had even given him a spare key so he could stop by if I wasn't home. He would always text to let me know beforehand though, and I had never heard my phone go off. I reached over to my bedside table and picked up my cell phone to see if my friend had sent me a text and maybe I'd just missed it or something. The bright light from my phone's screen and number pad blinded me. These were the days before phones had a light sensor that would dim the screen in the dark. This particular phone was so bright I could even use it as a flashlight by itself. Through squinted eyes, I could make out that it was around 9-something, but I couldn't really tell yet if I had an unread text or not. I set my phone aside and called out my friend's name. There were a couple of seconds of silence before I heard loud footfalls as someone started sprinting through the bottom floor of my house. I leapt out of bed by instinct and ran over to the closet. They were already up the stairs by the time I had opened the door and stepped inside. That house had 3 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms on either side of the hallway, the one I was in and a spare, and a bathroom at the end. The bedroom doors were both closed, but the bathroom door was cracked open. I heard whoever was in my house thunder down the hallway, right past my door and into the bathroom. Thank God he did that. That gave me just enough time to open the attic access in the ceiling of my closet and hoist myself up. I had just started to lift myself when the person ran back out of the bathroom. My feet were just barely inside the attic when my bedroom door burst open. I heard footsteps run into my room and stop. When they didn't see me in that room, they ran back out into the hallway and into the other room, which just had stacked boxes in a corner, some weights, and a table where I painted my miniature models. I guess they decided that if someone were hiding, it would be in the bedroom, because they charged back into my room and turned on the light. A moment later, the closet door was ripped open. I was crouched in my attic, just a foot or so away from the access, so I could try to stop them if they started to climb up. From my vantage point, all I could see was from about their knees down. They were wearing dirty blue jeans with frayed cuffs and worn work boots. After a few seconds of looking in the closet, they stepped away, and I heard a loud crash coming from my room, followed by screams of frustration and anger. That scream was the most unnerving part of the incident for me. It reminded me far too much of my stepfather, who would scream in a similar way when he lost his temper. He would eventually be put in a mental hospital for several mental disorders that resulted in erratic and violent tendencies. the man in my house ran back down the stairs. I could hear the crashes and clatters of random things as they were thrown around, and furniture was knocked all over the place. I stayed crouched there in the attic. I had left my cell phone down there when I ran for the closet, and I wasn't certain I could climb down without him hearing me. After some time, the noises finally stopped. I started counting very slowly. When I reached 1,000, I decided it was safe enough to climb down and call the police. The first thing I noticed when I exited the closet was that the intruder had flipped my bed completely over, I assume in an attempt to find me. That was the loud noise I had heard after he stepped away from the closet. I couldn't find my cell phone anywhere, so I went to the landline by the bed and called the cops. I waited in my room until I heard them call out from downstairs. The first floor was a complete mess, but I had expected that. Chairs had been knocked over, the sofa had been flipped. All the books, pictures, and knickknacks I had on my shelves were strewn across the floor. The cupboards in the kitchen had been opened, and all the boxed and canned foods had been thrown to the ground. As far as I could tell, though, the only thing missing was a single knife out of the wooden block in my kitchen. The police checked the house from top to bottom. They found that the side door had been forced open by something like a crowbar. They also found a few cigarette butts along my fence line, along with some foil and an empty pen tube, which the police said people often use to smoke meth, so they think he had been watching my house for a long while. I realized that he must have been out there smoking a cigarette when I got home. They collected up the evidence and told me I should stay with family or friends that night and get the door fixed as soon as possible. I opted to just not sleep. I moved a shelf over to block the broken door and spent the next couple hours cleaning things up. I would often go to the window with a flashlight and shine it along the fence line where the police found the cigarette butts and foil, but I didn't see anything. The next day, I called to have the door fixed and the motion lights installed at the back and sides of my house. I ran a phone cable up into the attic as well and added a landline there. I never wanted to be stuck up there without a phone again. Nothing else really happened in that house, though. I lived there another 3 years without any more incident. One more precaution I took, though, was practicing getting out of my bed, going to my closet, and climbing into the attic as quietly and quickly as possible. I even kept at this when I moved, except now I would go into a crawl space at the back of the closet instead of the attic. I try not to think about what would have happened had I been just a bit slower getting to the attic, or if he hadn't gone into the bathroom at the end of the hall first.